The first day of jury deliberations have come to a close in the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse. Before those deliberations began, though, Rittenhouse himself helped to choose, albeit randomly, the jurors who'll decide his fate. 18 jurors sat through the trial, but after the numbers of each juror were placed into a raffle drum, Rittenhouse pulled 6 pieces of paper from it to select the jurors that would be dismissed. The final 12 on the jury must now weigh the raft of charges against Rittenhouse for shooting 3 men, killing 2 of them in Kenosha last summer. Here's a little of yesterday's closing arguments.
The defendant decided to pull the trigger on his AR-15 4 times. That was his decision. And he is responsible for every bullet that comes out of that gun. He doesn't get a pass by pulling the trigger fast.
Ladies and gentlemen, Kyle was not an active shooter. That is a buzzword that the state wants to lash onto because it excuses the actions of that mob.
And joining us now with more are Patrick Cafferty, a Racine-based criminal defense attorney, Paul Bucher, former district attorney of Waukesha County for almost 20 years. He's now in private practice based out of Delafield, Wisconsin. Xavier Pope, lawyer, legal and culture contributor for ESPN Las Vegas and host of Suit Up News. And Joseph Lopez, longtime Chicago criminal defense attorney at Lopez & Lopez. Gentlemen, thanks to all of you for joining us. So we have to talk about, just moments ago, we saw this video of Kyle Rittenhouse drawing the numbers of the jurors who would not deliberate in his case. Paul Bucher, briefly, how unusual is that?
Well, it's the first I've ever seen. They still use the tumbler in some counties. Other counties are a little bit more advanced and they use a computer that just randomly draws the numbers. But I didn't see it. It's not like he had numbers up his sleeve or there's any stickies on the paper. I think it was just the judge trying to say, hey, look, we're going to make you an active part of the trial. I feel sorry for the alternates. I always do. But I wouldn't read more into that than people have. I mean, they think some black helicopter conspiracy is going on. It's no big deal. It's unusual, but a lot of things that have happened in this trial have been unusual.
So let's talk a little bit about the trial. Patrick Cafferty, let's come to you first, please. Your impressions of how both the performances of both the defense and the prosecution in this case, how do you think they did?
The reality of this case is that the case sort of tries itself because there's so much video involved here. So as far as the performance of the sides, they've each done what they were supposed to do. The state has clearly established that Kyle Rittenhouse killed these 2 people, almost killed another, endangered the lives of the other 2. The reality is it's about self-defense versus provocation. The defense has laid out their case for self-defense. Rittenhouse said all the right things. It's a matter of whether the jury is going to believe him. And then it's a matter of whether the state has proven that Rittenhouse provoked the attacks on him and therefore lost the right to use deadly force as the first option. So they've done what they were supposed to do.
Paul Bucher, back to you. What do you make of the various different charges that the prosecution has brought against Rittenhouse?
To be honest with you, way too many. I think I think the case is way overcharged. I've done this for 40 years, 42 years. I've done dozens and dozens of homicides. With all due respect and my condolences to the families, this is a straight up homicide case. If I were in the driver's seat, which I'm not, I would have charged 2 counts of first degree intentional homicide and 1 count of attempted first degree intentional homicide, knowing you're going into a self-defense case, knowing it's going to be a fist fight and you got to fight your way out of it. But I would have, all those other superfluous charges that they filed, they filed against one individual. They didn't even know who he is. He's unnamed. I call him Fanu Lanu, first name unknown, last name unknown. They don't even know who he or she is. They charged a curfew violation, the firearm case. I think they've lost focus on really what this is. This is a homicide case. 2 individuals have lost their life. You need to focus your time and resources on that. And the government lost their focus, in my opinion.
And Xavier Pope, what do you make of these various different charges? What's your impression of this case?
Of course, I respect my fellow counsel here on the panel, but I vehemently disagree with his assessment of the case in terms of being overcharged. We saw the undercharging be the issue with relation to the George Zimmerman case, and if the lesser offense that could have potentially maybe even convicted him. I think that the overcharge maybe they've been looked at in terms of the gun being a certain amount of inches and the battle over that. The jury never saw that go back and forth in terms of dropping that charge. I never had a chance to see any instructions in relation to that charge. It's not necessarily about the intentionality of it. It's whether Kyle Rittenhouse was a vigilante, wannabe EMT who came looking for trouble. And I think the prosecution able to show that during their closing arguments, using video to show that, and to show that his conduct was reckless. I think that probably is the most suitable way to look at this particular case, instead of looking at someone going into a situation, maybe looking to intentionally cause harm to other people. I think that's the place where the sweet spot, where the jury we may find may be more surprising to people than this outcome than people are maybe expecting at this point.
Okay. Joseph Lopez, we even saw Judge Schroeder berating the prosecutor on more than one occasion during this trial. Did you see any obvious missteps by either the prosecution or the defense?
No, I didn't really see any real missteps. I mean, you're not doing your job if you don't get yelled at by the judge. Happens all the time. Happens on both sides all the time. Both sides will violate orders. They'll forget. They'll get really into it. But I didn't see any real missteps. I think that both sides did a great job. They both had good facts, and I think that the presentation by both sides might have been a little dry. It might have been a little, maybe not as much action as other people would like, but they covered the facts on both sides. And I think that this jury can either convict or not convict. It's really a close case, and I think it's too close to call.
Too close to call. So the jury in this case, we know that they are made up of 7 women, 5 men. All of them are white, except there is one person of color, and there's not a lot of clarity on the background of that person. But Xavier, back to you. Though we know that both the defendant in this case and the people that he shot are all white, what role do you think race plays in this case?
Well, the person that was shot in order to cause this incident was police shooting of Jacob Blake. And so that was what the whole scenario was around. I think that the jury is pretty clear about what happened before the incident happened. I think with the defense, which he really had a really weak close, he spent a lot of his time not really focusing on the facts in terms of rebutting the specific facts, attacking the prosecutor, calling him a liar, really focusing his attention on the politics of the moment, calling them a mob, not any unsubstantiated, showing even framing people in the gas station and what they look like. And I think that is something that he's attempting to play on, maybe implicit bias of the jury. We all know that some of the records around some of the jury bias and things of that nature in this country and some of the criminal justice system. And I think that's what he was still looking to play into, even though the victims were white. So I think it's important to look at that. And also the connection with racialized violence with white people who defend African Americans in the civil rights struggle, also some of the connection with the politics, even of our president being connected to a black president. So I think it's really important to look at race, not just in a vacuum of whether the victims were white and the shooter was white, but also politics around the moment and look at it from a much more broader sense.
Patrick Cafferty, same question to you. Do you think race plays any role in this case?
Honestly, the way that I have viewed politics and race in this case is who's going to end up in the jury box. And we now know who those people are. So we have 7 white women, 4 white men, and 1 Hispanic male. I'm not sure exactly where the people are from, but generally speaking, it's easy to identify what party they affiliate with, depending upon what part of the county they come from. Statistically, white women are more likely to be Democrats, and white men are more likely to be Republicans, Hispanic male more likely to be Democrats. And I bring all this up because so many people have seen this through a political prism, where you have people on the left who say that Kyle Rittenhouse is the poster child for everything that's wrong with gun culture in the United States. You have people on the right who basically say, hey, we should give Kyle Rittenhouse an award for what he did. So I think that those issues will play into the ultimate decision that these jurors make. And it really may come down to the preconceived biases that they brought into the jury box with them. And then once they're there, they see what they want to see. As Joe indicated, there's plenty here for everybody. Both sides were able to make their case. And in a case like that, where both sides have the ammunition to support their positions, it sometimes comes down to just who's in the box, what their preconceived notions are, and how they want to bring this to a close.
And before we run out of time, we know that the defense still trying to get this case thrown out over prosecutorial misconduct is what they're alleging. Paul Bucher, though, who do you think has got to be feeling best about their case right now as the jury deliberates?
I think the defense did not ask for any lesser included or less serious cases. They kind of took the strategy of go big or go home. I do disagree that race or politics has anything to do with this case. I know some of the media is trying to make it into that. I don't think it has anything to do with it. The judge struggled to keep that out. And I believe there was prosecutorial error. I think the prosecution did comment inappropriately on the defendant's post-arrest silence, and that's going to be an appellate issue if he is convicted.
And Joseph Lopez, again, before we're out of time, your thoughts. Who do you think has got to be feeling best about their case right now?
Well, I think the defense is probably feeling the best about their case right now because they were able to use very effectively the prosecution's witnesses as their own witnesses, which is one of the tricks defense lawyers will do. Good defense lawyers will take that bad witness, turn him around, and make him his witness. But it's still an uphill battle. You look at those jury instructions. I don't know if those jurors even understood it. They asked for extra copies today.
Right.
It seems that they're very interested in the jury instructions.
And we know
I think that what people don't understand is, when you have self-defense, it's not absolute. There are limits to self-defense. You just can't blow people away because you think you're scared. And that is why I think these jury instructions are very important.
I appreciate all four of you joining us, Patrick Cafferty, Paul Bucher, Xavier Pope, and Joseph Lopez.
Thank you.
Thank you.